Hello, this is Alan Heyman, the CEO of the SMLR Group. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today on this seminar catering to the cybersecurity and the legal aspects of cybersecurity, sponsored by the Raytheon Cyber Products Group, the law firm of, it's a long name, I always seem to forget it, but the name is Winget, Spadafora and Schwartzberg. The managing partner of the Chicago office, Hillard Sterling, will be joining us. Myself and Dan Velez, a subject matter expert from the Raytheon Cyber Products Group. The purpose of our webinar today, since we understand that most people have sort of been burned out by the large amount of cybersecurity conversations, advertisements, webinars, and such, is to take a total view of cybersecurity, cyber governance, and what it means not only from the technical side, but also from the legal side. This is becoming an area of great importance because of the significance of the laws, the changes in the laws, the participation of the legal people as well. I'd like to thank our participants for joining in, and let me turn the first part of the WebEx over to Dan Velez, one of the top Raytheon subject matter experts. Dan?
Hey, thank you, Alan. I'm going to share my screen here. Make sure I can, how are we doing? How's that look?
Looks good.
All right, very good. All right, so thanks, Alan, and thanks also to Hillard for joining me here, because you know, a big part of what we're seeing, what we at Raytheon are seeing in industry these days, is the implementation of user activity monitoring in the wake of you know, things like Snowden and private manning and other big level, you know, high level breaches that have been, you know, splashed across the headlines recently. And so I thought we would take a couple of minutes at least to provide the listeners a little bit of a roadmap toward that user activity monitoring activity within the organization, and how to tackle the problem. I'm seeing a lot of customers, you know, buying tools, running out and buying tools without really having an understanding or a framework and how they're going to use those tools and how they're going to use those tools properly. So my presentation is primarily on the implementation of that user activity monitoring and addressing the insider threat, and then hopefully Hillard will round that out and give us more guidance on the legal aspects of doing so. You know, from an insider threat perspective, it's helpful. I've actually found some of our customers haven't really spent the time to really consider what is an insider threat, right? You know, it's more than just the data thief, right? It's more than someone who's downloading data on a Friday night before leaving their job and going somewhere else new on Monday. You know, we're talking about sabotage of systems. We're talking about collusion and fraud. You know, I have one customer who's really interested in understanding that when their buyers are making procurements for the retail shelves, that negotiation and selection really has been in the best interest of the company and not in the best interest of the buyer. There's also a big concern with, you know, active shooter issues, violence in the workplace, and so on. So it's really important that you, you know, step back, push back from the table a little bit, and get a good definition on, define for you what's important in the insider threat and how we're going to mitigate it with this user activity monitoring kind of solutions. But what I've found in the past couple of years, as we take our defense-grade technologies out to the private sector, is that you know, there's a general distaste for auditing of users in the workplace, and these are some of the reasons that you know, that I've seen. You know, it's not an easy problem, but with the right solutions and the right support, it can be done pretty easily. But generally, the reasons that activities are not organizations are not providing for user activity monitoring generally falls into one of these 4 categories. But it's common sense. Even if you go to, I would highly recommend anyone who's beginning to venture out into this area to go to the Carnegie Mellon website and spend some time looking at CERT operates an insider threat web page, and you'll find great guides and examples of establishing an insider threat program and the user activity monitoring portion of that program, and highlights time and time again in the common sense guide of just how important it is to return visibility to managers and supervisors of user activity in order to assess that activity, both from a detection of improper activities point of view, but also for something as simple as process improvement. Oftentimes we find that user activity monitoring isn't just about walking an employee out the door, ripping the badge off their chest and sending them on their way, but sometimes it really reveals problems with processes in an organization. So what we're attempting to achieve is kind of a restoration of, with that user activity monitoring solution, a restoration of the ability of the manager to do just what it says here. You don't get what you expect, from user activity. You get what you inspect. So you have to inspect, you have to go look, you have to ask questions, and so on. And so,
and this is Alan. Do you find that the insider threat as a concept is an old concept, or is this a new concept? Because I really haven't heard too many people speaking about it over the last couple of years.
Yeah, well, just the term itself, insider threat, has been more prevalent. I've been doing this for over 15 years, and insider threat as a mission area inside of government has been there for quite some time. In the commercial space, there's different activities, different names that the programs may go by: asset protection, risk management, compliance, ethics, and so on. It's had different names, and so maybe we're getting wrapped around the axle on the term insider threat. With an insider threat program, the user activity monitoring piece really is just one component, because what we expect to see when you bring in the user activity monitoring is that there is a complete program, because as you can see, and this is a simplified description of a comprehensive insider threat program, but it's very, it's a very involved process. It's a living, breathing thing that involves policies and processes and the application of technical controls like identity and access management controls and access control lists and so on, training and awareness, and so on. And so, that detection piece is one piece of the insider threat program. It's very important, but the detection piece alone, is not going to solve your problem. So when we're called in and someone wants that detection piece, usually it's something like this. Something bad has happened in an organization and it's very reactive, and we see management and the internal discussions that the customer spaces kind of proceeds along this discussion here. And when I show up to help a customer operationalize their tools and provide for a cyber observation of user activity in the context of the complete program, we find that box is empty, right? There isn't much of a program. So it's not just a technology problem. It's really important that you understand that the technology's role is to support the program. So when we implement the auditing and monitoring solution, I'm looking to apply auditing and monitoring rules against the company policies, or company policies being followed, or the processes being followed. Someone is discharged or removed from the organization, or their access is actually turned off, secured, cut off within 8 hours of them leaving the organization, and so on. So we're using auditing and monitoring against the technical controls. Is that DLP solution really working? We use the auditing and monitoring solution against training and awareness, right? We're checking to see how often are users actually clicking on those attempted phishing attacks and so on. As part of a risk management program, the auditing and monitoring solution can be an integral part of protecting critical pieces of information inside our organization, those things that really are the bread and butter of our organization. The auditing and monitoring solution supports investigation, the ability to take a quick deep dive, resolve an issue, and move on quickly. So, when we talk about assembling a program and incorporating the user activity monitoring, I hope to give you this little bit of a strategy. I'm going to blaze right through this, but anybody has a request for these slides and would like to discuss this in further, just reach out to Alan. But here are the areas that we're going to talk about. Establishing a program and defining our business case, getting the right staff and stakeholders together, getting everybody a little educated, and establishing some governance and oversight over the activity, document our project plan, select the right tools, and get into an implementation. So I find that this area right here, this is why I put it number one, priority number one, right? Assign a belly button. Good old Navy term. Without a belly button, nothing happens. You have to assign someone, put someone in charge, put out a memo, a directive from the chief executive, letting everyone in the organization know this is important, and this is the person in charge, and this person has this authority. I tell the story about how we went to an engineering lab, and we were walking to do a site survey to do a deployment of a technical solution, and the crusty old scientist sitting back there in his office, we came walking in to see how many machines were actually in there, looked at us, pointed at the door, and said, "Get out." And we were just being managed as an IT project at the time and not really a command-wide, insider threat program. And so we didn't have any recourse. We had to leave until we kind of regrouped and established a belly button for the command that everyone would respect. It's really important to understand the why. All right, why are we doing the user activity monitoring? It's important because this understanding or this requirement is going to trickle down into our processes and procedures and affect our implementation plan. And so it's really important to understand very specifically the business case for the user activity monitoring so that we can ensure continuously that our auditing plan continues to map to that business case, and that we don't stray off the right path. Getting the right staff together really sometimes is, the quality of that staff. That's a great bullet there. Is more important than the technology. I'm not putting the deprecating the technology, but making sure that there is a cross section of skills in the programs, so that within the program team, the team that's putting together the insider threat program and deploying a solution, they have a solid understanding of security, computer security, and so on. And as Hilary mentioned, this area is ripe for problems if all the legal aspects are not well understood with respect to creating records and handling of records and data, getting the right program in place to ensure that user activity monitoring is conducted in accordance with multitude laws and regulations. But there's also a need for a little bit of insider threat training. So I mentioned earlier that Carnegie Mellon class. I recently took their the Carnegie Mellon Insider Threat Program Manager class. Very good class. Gives a nice overview, kind of lays out the steps to a program, gives you a number of resources to help you understand implementation strategy, and it takes just a few days of effort to get into that. And then round out this team with a little bit of desktop engineering and people who understand how the machines are put together on the network and that understand basic forensic tools like access data, FTK, and so on. So it's a little bit of a challenge, but picking the right staff is one of the most critical decisions you'll make in getting your program together. And the next is not, you would think is obvious, but it's going to be really important that we get all the right stakeholders, as many people at the table early on in the project as possible, so that A, we get the right requirements, first of all. You know, HR has audit requirements, user activity monitoring requirements. HR is probably involved in, you know, violence in the workplace issues. It's important that computer network defense folks be involved in that. You know, there's a need for information security aspects to the insider threat program and its user activity monitoring, and so on. I'll highlight here, you know, general counsel. Really important that, you know, you do not want to invite your general counsel to the last meeting before the system goes live. They need to be there at the first meeting to make sure that the various decisions and aspects of the program are planned accordingly.
And you talk about auditing a great deal. What percentage of the auditing, you know, my background involves a certain amount of accounting, and I remember that we had to do an auditing of maybe 10 or 20% of the test subjects and then extrapolate out to get a number. Is that how you envision this working, or is your auditing much more encompassing?
Yeah, well, depending on the tools that you're selecting, you know, generally the auditing will vary across the organization. There is no one-size-fits-all. There's no, and the most effective strategy for auditing is not to throw everybody in one big bucket and audit the same thing for everyone, but instead, you know, you really want to find a tool that allows you to perform role-based auditing. That is the ability to put certain auditing rules, say maybe on the contracts and acquisition staff, and different kinds of rules on the privileged users that are, you know, managing the domain. So the ability to do, you know, role-based auditing and monitoring is really what is a best practice today. So it's important. I hope I answered your question, Alan.
Yes.
It's important. I'm going to go back up one. It's important. You know, there is no easy button. There's a lot of solutions out there that would like you to believe that you know, smash this button, we'll find all the bad guys in your organization. It's really, you know, that science, the ability to look at disparate data sources and kind of put pieces together and tell a story and maybe even predict activity. Those things are emerging. They're really being fine-tuned, or well, you know, deployed operationally just in the last couple of years. But by and large, I'll tell you that this kind of work really is more art than science today. While that science is emerging, it's still the, you know, knowledge and understanding of investigators from within the organization on what's happened recently, the kinds of trends that you're seeing inside the organization. This is how we're going to use this tool. But when you go and get the education, you'll learn things like this, where they've modeled, Carnegie Mellon has modeled, for example, insider threat in a system dynamics model, where they talk about how someone had certain predispositions to aberrant behavior. And then unmet expectations is meant to describe someone who's now was happy with their job, but they're not happy with their job anymore. This is the malicious insider, by the way. And then they move on to, this user moves on to some precursor activity and hunting and gathering and kind of nosing around, like, how am I gonna get back at these guys? And then there's the act, right? The installation of the software, the download of the files, and so on. And then, but the way we use this education and this kind of a model is, along the way, there's the opportunity for technical observables with your auditing and monitoring solution. So that, for example, like unmet expectations, and this is just an example, you know, resume.doc might indicate someone's displeasure with, you know, the current work situation and maybe thinking about going somewhere else. And so I'm not suggesting that alone is a reason to go and investigate someone, but I'm just highlighting that as an example of different areas of the kill chain, so to speak, you know, within these models provide for the ability to apply auditing and monitoring and pick up activities, observe activities at different areas of the model. So what I'm trying to highlight here for you is really get a good understanding of how that technology is the enabler to the other areas we're talking about.
And it sounds like what you're describing is an ability to predict employee activity. Is that really what you're talking about?
Well, you know, those technologies are beginning to emerge, but they're still being fine-tuned. This is why on my previous slides here I was trying to describe that. You know, there's still a lot of work to be done by an analyst with the right tools. It requires a lot of corporate knowledge, understanding of the organization to really flesh out issues and uncover problems. That's what I'm trying to get at. There are solutions that are coming out, and we've partnered with a couple of organizations that are doing some really interesting things about with detection and prediction. So, for example, there's one company that we work with that has analytics that help to identify flight risks. That is, employees that are getting ready to probably leave their job. And what happens, Alan, when people leave their job? They take
a lot of information.
That's right, they take data. And so our customers are using this, you know, science-based algorithm in terms of watching communication patterns and other aspects of activity in order to predict that, hey, this guy might be leaving this organization, and enable the organization to implement a risk management plan around potentially departing employees. We don't want to wait until Carnegie Mellon will tell you, that data set happens around 30 days before someone leaves the organization, typically. And, you know, if you're waiting for the 2-week notice, you might be too late, right? So,
is this a methodology that Raytheon uses for themselves?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. We use all our tools and have a program like this inside of Raytheon as well. And it's actually helped us to enhance, you know, features and capabilities that solve our problems. And because they solve our problems, they're probably solving problems inside of enterprises all across the world. Next aspect, though, of this program, you can see we're building that pyramid over there to the right so that we actually have something in our box to take our technology to, but is, you know, the Washington Post test and making sure that we have a governance and oversight plan that provides for, you know, watching the watchers, identifying abuses in the use of these kinds of tools and technologies, making sure that initiation of inquiries and escalation from an inquiry to an investigation and maybe a referral to law enforcement is all handled properly. And so it's really important that you engage folks like Hillard to understand kind of the rules of the road here, and that we can provide the C-suite the confidence that we're doing this kind of work properly and in an auditable way. The next is, you know, putting together the project plan. The project plan should define the who, what, when, and where. Here's some areas that I would suggest that your project plan cover. One of the things you're going to have to make sure, you know, for example, is you're going to have to decide right up front, are we going to advertise this requirement for this kinds of tools and technologies and lay our soul out in the form of an RFP out for the whole world to see, or are we going to do, you know, acquire this kind of tool differently? So are we going to go overt with these capabilities, or are we going to be more hidden in the enterprise? Are we going to use our IT shop, enterprise IT folks to deploy and support, so on? How about the first bullet, you know, data owner? We had a project where we stopped for about 3 months while there was a wrestling over who's going to own this data, the user activity monitoring data, that is, because it came from all across all different branches of the lines of business and so on. So the project plan is going to be really important because we're going to use that later. And now you're ready for the tool. These are some of the features that I would suggest potential customers of these kinds of tools and technologies spend a little time on, and I'm going to highlight that third bullet there. Don't forget the command and control features. And when I say command and control features, I mean, you know, it's great to see a cool slick on an agent that I can put on a desktop and see, you know, all the different gobs of information that you can get off that desktop, and how it grabs data and sends it up to the server, video and file activity and so on. You know, that's great, but it's really important to understand your command and control features, like, you know, do we need to be able to segregate the data into different buckets? Does HR need to have its own view and access to the tool, and the computer network defense have a different view, or security have a different view? Or is there a need for like two-person controls in the handling of manipulation of policies and exporting of data and sharing of data with outside entities and so on? So spend a lot of time understanding your command and control features, and we can provide additional information there. But it's really important that you find the right tool that's going to fit. The privileged user tough. It has an output that you and I, you don't have to be a computer scientist to understand, and is enterprise ready. And then lastly here, defeating the obstacles, putting together the whole plan. You can look at the first and last bullet. They're the same bullets, because implementing user activity monitoring in the context of an insider threat program is probably going to be a new thing, and it's going to mean a little bit of planning and discussion across the organization and different stovepipes across that organization, and just be prepared to put a little time into this thing here. Communications plan I highlight there. Early on in slide 2 or 3, I mentioned why aren't we auditing and monitoring our users for compliance issues and so on. Sometimes it's the culture, and so early on in this program, let's get started now with communications plan to our employees, and let's remind them of their responsibilities for proper handling and our right to properly audit and monitor from a business perspective the handling of the data and the compliance with our acceptable use policies, for example. Ask your vendor, right, for implementation plans and so on. So there you go. So if you've got a handle on, yes, sir.
I was going to say, it's a lot of information. A lot of information. It's well put together. I know one of the things that you've been educating our group on is the ability to take the policies that stakeholders like Hillard's organization or HR people have that can be then written into the software, so that the software has the ability to monitor and audit the policies of an enterprise to that specifics. Are those policies easy to put together, or is it very complicated?
Well, it depends on the tool you select. Our tool, they kind of look like Outlook rules. So if you've ever written an Outlook rule and you can build a sentence, you can write a policy. Not very challenging, but you highlight a real good point in that what we're talking about here is taking something that General Counsel probably has already signed off on. They probably already reviewed your acceptable use policy. And when I say an acceptable use policy, I mean it's the document that you hand slide across the desk to the user and say, hey, before I give you your username and password and grant you access to our corporate information enterprise, you have to agree to these things. And on there, on that 1 or 2 page document, you typically find things like, hey, I won't introduce unauthorized hardware or software. I won't manipulate the security profile of the machine. I won't turn off the antivirus. I'll alert the help desk if there's I suspect a problem, or I see an antivirus alert, so on and so forth. And so the user activity monitoring solution should be able to enable you to digest those sentences into simple auditable policies for automated enforcement in the enterprise.
If I may chime in briefly on that, this is Hillard. I just wanted to make sure we're all talking about the same thing, and that there really are 2 levels of policies here, right? There's the corporate policies that Dan's been talking about, and that I work on, which is essentially a roadmap of the kinds of rules and guidelines for the organization to follow. Then the second level is the technological policies, which translate those corporate policies into specific technical and technological restrictions on the users. And I think isn't that where Raytheon comes in on the latter half of that?
Yeah.
please?
Yeah, thank you, Hillary, for clearing that up. You know, we use those terms interchangeably so often. That's exactly right. You have the corporate policies, as I indicated in my earlier slides, with the wedge, you know, one of those pie wedges where those company-wide policies are the basis for some of the user activity monitoring, and your tool may translate them into tool-based policies that may automate some of the enforcement. Thanks for clarifying that, Hillary.
Sure, and yeah, that's what I'm going to be talking about too, is why it's so important to do that, because of the huge legal risks. And I don't know if, hopefully, everyone can see my my slides up here. Are they working, guys?
Looks good.
Yes, looks fine.
Great, great. Well, the point that I want to make is why it's so important to have these policies on both levels in place, and that's because the risks, the legal exposure is huge. Everyone out there, whether they know it or not, has been hacked. And certainly if you haven't, you're one of the lucky few, and it's going to happen. So you've got to be prepared on many levels. And if you're not, you're going to face huge exposure. I just wanted to touch some of these issues. You know, what are the causes of action? And pre-breach, how do you get ready with these corporate policies? And once it's happened, and again, it's more of a when rather than an if, what do you do to try to protect yourself? And how do you investigate, and how do you notify those who are affected by the breach? And, you know, the big problem here is it's getting very personal. You know, boards of directors are being held personally liable for failing to protect the company. And actually, corporate officers can be held liable, too. It's not just boards. Corporate officers, if they breach their fiduciary duties, a lot of states allow a lawsuit against that officer individually. So now we're not just talking about some artificial construct of a company perhaps facing liability. This is personal. This is your house, your car, your boat, whatever you have. If you're an officer or a board member and you have failed to protect the company based on what you knew or should have known, and I'm emphasizing those words because actual knowledge isn't the issue. It's what did you reasonably and foreseeably know, or what should you have known about the risks that your companies face. That's the standard that plaintiffs are going to hold you to, that courts are ultimately going to hold you to. And they'll say, if there's a breach, believe me, they'll find something that you should have known about and failed to address, whether it was protecting the company, whether it was disclosing the risks to your colleagues and to those who were in a position to address it, and addressing it itself. Did you fail to address risks about which you reasonably should have known?
Hillard, this is Alan. You seem to have made a transition from the technical aspects that Dan was talking about to a purely legal. How is these connected? It looks like it's two separate entities. It's not,
well,
is it?
Well, they're two separate issues, but they're together like hand in glove. And here's how I visualize it. You have, first and foremost, the need to think about, identify, and address your legal risks. If you don't know that and you don't think about legal exposure and what rules apply, we'll be talking about that in a minute, well, then you're at most going to get half of it right on the technical side. And 50% in every classroom I've seen is an F. And it certainly is an F in the courtroom. So you first have to address the legal risks, and you have to, first of all, know what those are, and then work with your counsel to address them. And then, as part of that, comes into the equation the technological solutions, which Dan was discussing and referencing, especially toward the end when he's talking about these technological policies that go into place. And those are directly translated from the legal elements in the legal policies and the corporate policies that you have in place because of those laws. So one leads directly to the other, and if they're not working together, the program is deficient.
So let me ask a question really to Dan and to you, Hillard. Am I to understand that once the policies are drafted by the attorneys, they're then developed into policies that run the software from a technological and a legal side in order to do the necessary audits across all the endpoints of the software? Is that correct, Dan?
No, that's right. That's right. And it's important that we have Hillard in the room as we discuss the origin and purpose of the corporate policy as we attempt to write the electronic audit policy.
Again, I think that's a good summary, Alan. And I do think, as I was saying before, you really start with the legal side. And that'll tell you what you need to be doing in the company. Then you move to actually how do you do that technologically? What kind of software solutions do you implement? How do you translate those solutions to the users and convey them and get everybody on board so that they're working like a well-oiled machine in using, transmitting, and storing the data in your organization? So one leads to the other. And in fact, I'll talk about why they're important briefly, and then we'll get into the policies themselves and the elements that I'm talking about, which are those corporate policies driven by the law. And here's the law. There's a lot of law. Some of it's pretty specific. Everyone out there probably knows what statutes govern your organization. If you're in healthcare, you've got to worry about HIPAA and high tech. If you're providing financial services, Graham-Leach-Bliley. Public corporation, Sarbanes-Oxley. Everyone is pretty aware of those, but then it gets pretty nebulous as you move down, and I ordered these bullet points from specific at the top to the most amorphous at the bottom. But they all apply, and in fact, some of the bottom ones apply even more squarely, and they're being used a lot more by plaintiffs and regulators than the ones that are detailed and known to everybody. So you start getting into, like, what are plaintiffs going to claim? If your organization gets hacked and data gets leaked or sold on the black market and people start complaining, filing lawsuits, and regulators start sniffing at the door, well, they're going to claim you failed to comply with those statutes, the regulations under those statutes, guidelines issued by the relevant regulatory agencies. And now, getting into the real nebulous zone, you fail to comply with best practices, whatever that means. And that's certainly a subject to interpretation. But let me tell you, the plaintiffs and the regulators will interpret it in a way that favors their case. And usually it's enough to get them into the case so that they can sustain it long enough to cause you to want to settle it before you take a real risk and have a judge or a jury decide. Reasonableness. Are you being reasonable in the way that you are identifying and addressing your data security risks? That's a tough question to answer, but you have to. Reasonableness is basically a cost-benefit analysis. If the benefits of taking a measure outweigh the costs, you're supposed to take it. It is reasonable for you to take it and unreasonable for you not to. That standard is being applied vigorously by the Federal Trade Commission, which recently in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, which is a very powerful court over on the East Coast, has affirmatively rubber-stamped the FTC's authority to regulate data security. Even worse and more concerning, I think, for all who could be attacked by the FTC, or sued by the FTC, I should say, is the fact that the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, and I think a lot of courts out there as well, believes that the FTC can sue you if you allegedly were unreasonable. And unreasonable, according to the FTC, is anything that leads to a data breach that could and should have been done to avoid it.
Hillard, the legalities that you're referring to are rather complicated, and I have a great deal of respect for the legal profession but I get a little confused as to if I'm a CEO of a company with 500 or 1,000 employees, how do I get all this information down to the lowest level so I know everybody within the company is following what they're supposed to be following, so that best practices, reasonableness is something that I can stand behind, as opposed to saying, well, here's the laws and I have no control over my employees? How do you do that?
First thing you do is you got to get your arms around what laws are applying to you, and it's this whole bullet point list that's on the screen right now. And that only can be done in close consultation with counsel, and I mean in-house counsel and outside counsel. And we'll talk a little bit about why it's important to have both to the table. And this isn't just a commercial. I know some people out there listening may think, well, there's a lawyer telling us that we need lawyers, and obviously he's doing it for his own self-interest. Well, why it's important to do this has everything to do with the survival of your company. There are many companies out there that don't exist anymore because of the debilitating expenses associated with addressing a data breach. It's a material cost for even the largest companies. And if you're not working with your counsel, you're not going to get these legal standards translated, like you're saying, Alan, in a way that is understandable. What tangible measures do I need to take in order to comply with all of these bullet points? That's the question you need to address, and if you don't know what the laws are, you don't know how they apply in your industries, you're not going to answer these questions correctly. You may not answer them at all, and you're not taking the first critical step toward information governance. And
are the electronic policies that Dan was referring to, is that a solution in order to deploy all this legality down to every level of your employee membership?
And yeah, I like the way you put it, because it is a trickle-down visual. You can think of it as an upside-down triangle, inverted pyramid, because you have at the top the plethora of governing rules and laws, like we see on the screen here. And then you translate those down, okay, what does that really mean in terms of my company? How do I act reasonably? And that, again, is the heart-to-heart with lawyers, outside counsel, to figure that out. And then moving down to the point of the pyramid, you need to say, okay, now what technical solutions should I be implementing to be reasonable or even better, more than reasonable? It's always better to do more rather than less, especially if it's a close call. And that's where you get into these technical solutions that Dan was talking about. I know Raytheon has what I think is a pretty unique system for implementing these corporate policies as technological and technical policies. But you need to think, okay, what technical solutions do we need, and how can I implement all of these concepts on the ground floor with, in day-to-day usage with my employees? How can I get them to do this? And as we'll talk about in a second, and I'm going to move to this slide because this is what we're really talking about, how do I get my employees to do this stuff, to follow these technical policies that are on the workstation, that they need to be thinking about any time they click on an email, any time that they translate or transmit data, anytime they're thinking about storing or deleting data. And that's where, the third bullet point here, implementing the policies. And how do you do that? The last three, training, more training, and even more training. And I cannot say that word enough. I don't mind being a broken record on this, because training is the most critical component. It's the last thing you need to do through this process. It's the point of the pyramid. But then if it's not done, you could just throw the whole program away, because if your employees are not following your policies, both the corporate policies and the technological policies, then they are worse than having no policies at all, because a plaintiff and a regulator will quiz you and drill you on a witness stand while you're under oath and they will ask you, hey, you have these policies in place, right? Let's go through them line by line. And isn't it true that you didn't tell employee X, the one who caused this intrusion and the data leak, isn't it true that he or she didn't know what this policy was and that you didn't train him or her on that policy? Oh, you say you did? All right. Where's the document memorializing that?
Hillard, every time I see training, more training, and I said more training, all I see are more and more dollar signs and more manpower and more sometimes just talking to the wall. Dan, when you talk about auditing and policies, do these policies that you're referring to, do they identify breaches in policies so that training is not something that's ongoing with humans, but is really something that is computer-driven?
Okay, that's a great question. We do have some customers that, take their auditing monitoring solution and map it toward their training and awareness program so that, for example, they can count and measure events and the effectiveness of the training, as Hillard was mentioning. So, for example, if you ban removable media usage with respect to certain information inside your organization, maybe you want to just count those things week after week, those violations. So now bounce that against the awareness program. The awareness program can see those metrics, see where the training may be deficient, and improve the training, increase the frequency of the training to drive those numbers down. So there is a give and take. What I would say is the auditing and monitoring solution enables you to gauge the effectiveness of that training.
Well, that sounds like it's a reduction in cost. That sounds good.
Yeah, and Alan, if I may disagree with you too, it's really not that expensive, and it's penny wise and pound foolish not to do it. Training really involves several things. Of course, you got to get everybody into a room, and you've got to educate them. That's not all that expensive. It takes time, but it's well worth it. You've got to get people to read the policies and sign off acknowledging that they did so. Again, that's not a big cost. And there are a lot of companies out there that have these really neat testing mechanisms where they'll send phishing emails to your employees. And, phishing, of course, is a scam where someone sends a pretty, believable email from somebody that you think you're getting it from. Obviously, it's from either somebody in a basement or someone in China or Russia or, Syria or some country in Africa where these things come from, and they say, hey, I'm your CEO, and I want you to click on this link. And it looks like it came from him because this hacker is very astute and has studied up on your CEO, probably went to his or her Facebook page, and has been looking at emails that he or she sends, so he knows how to make it look like an email from your CEO. And as soon as you click on it, the malware is in your system. So there are companies that will send those phishing scams around to your employees and tell you who's clicking on it, so you can get these people to fix it. And they're not expensive services to retain. These vendors, you could do them yourself. There's all kinds of ways you could train your employees that are very efficient and cost-effective. And again, not doing it is very foolish and can get extraordinarily expensive. I'm going to have to zip through some of these other slides. I did want to leave a few minutes for any follow-up and a question or two if we have time for that. But let's talk about the policies a little bit more in detail. You got policies that have to, these are the corporate policies, of course, which are the ones that you draft alongside your counsel that comply with the applicable laws. And they have to be compliant. These are not policies you want to be pulling off of LegalZoom. With all due respect to LegalZoom, it's good for some types of documents out there, but it's not good to protect your company from a data breach and give you a good story to tell a regulator or a plaintiff or a judge or a jury because they're generic and strongly outside the scope of whatever rules and regulations govern your company. So they're done for the universe, which means they're extremely general and really a good starting point to bet. We talk about these policies governing use and access and transmission. Of course, you want good password policies. You got to be telling your employees that a good password is not the word password, or 12345, or their kids' names, because their kids' names are known to every hacker who's smart enough, and it doesn't take a lot of intelligence to get on your Facebook page, or your dog's name. It's astounding how many people have the word password as their password, but it's, you know, I'm constantly shocked, but I shouldn't be, at the kind of statistics you see out there on the weak passwords. And how about the last one, which really is last but not least, encryption. That has to be embedded in every single company's policy, and the encryption needs to be compliant with whatever rules and regulations govern the company, and everybody needs to be encrypting their data. It's not excusable anymore not to. It's very cheap, it's very easy, and if you're not encrypting and you get hacked and you get sued, that's going to be Exhibit A for the plaintiffs. Moving through these other policies, email. You've got to be educating and training. Again, there's that word training, your employees to use their email in a way that's compliant with the rules and the regs that govern your company. And there's several points here. And I don't know, Alan, if we're going to be sharing these PowerPoints. I hope we are with our listeners. Happy to do that. These bullet points are where you should be focusing email policies.
Hillard, yes, we are. They'll be posted, and everybody will get emails as to where it is. In addition, we are offering to all listeners a free 1-hour consultation service, whether it pertains to the legal side or the technical side, and my contact information will be at the end of the presentation. So if anybody wants to take advantage of that, please contact me, and I'll coordinate the activities.
I appreciate that, and yeah, fully on board with a free consultation where, you know, we could really sit down and dig a little deeper into what each person is or should be concerned about, given what their organization does, the kind of data it handles, et cetera. Final thing here, no expectation of privacy. You need to be telling your employees that. There are lawsuits out there where employees are claiming that companies violated their privacy by looking into their emails. So there are good employment law reasons to have that kind of a principle there, as well as a data security reason, but telling people that, you know, this is the company's email, and you can't be using it as though it's your own. We all do it to some degree, but it's got to be kept to a minimum, because that's, again, how the hackers are getting into the corporate computer systems, because employees are out there surfing. They're on Facebook, at least what they think is Facebook. They're clicking on all these potentially nefarious links, and that should be a no-no. Same thing with mobile devices. Bring your own devices, BYOD. Got to have automatic locks. Got to be able to wipe these things from afar if they're lost. You know, how many people out there have lost a phone? And I'd be surprised if anyone out there hasn't. And that's a huge point of vulnerability. If you're not able to wipe that clean, many of those phones have legally protected data on them, potentially even sensitive client information and maybe even healthcare information. I'm just going to touch on this, and I'll leave the rest of the time for questioning, because a lot of this has to do with lawyers, and I encourage everyone who listens to this to pass these slides along to your in-house counsel and outside counsel, because they need to be aware of the importance of protecting the information from getting disclosed in litigation. There's all kinds of negative information that companies have that's just by virtue of the fact that they're talking about this stuff. They're communicating internally about their vulnerabilities, and that's good. We want that to happen, of course. If you're not talking about your vulnerabilities, you're putting your head in the sand, and that's not an effective defense. But if you're talking about your vulnerabilities, and that email or memo or voicemail or text is recorded, that's an exhibit for someone who's going to attack your company for knowing about risks and failing to address them adequately. So when you have a data breach, there's several steps that happen after the breach. You have the initial investigation, you've got notification obligations, and then you've got to deal with fending off attackers. It's really a sad reality that companies that are attacked and hacked are victimized a second time by getting attacked by plaintiffs and regulators for not doing enough. So it's attacking the victim. It's happening out there a lot. And you'll need to fend off those attacks. But you need to fend them off in a way that's protecting your critical information from getting handed over to your adversaries and have them turn into exhibits. And the way you do that is engaging outside counsel so that you can protect that information under the attorney-client communication privilege. That's not easy to do. You need to manage communications very carefully. So get outside counsel involved early at the outset while you're doing the preventive measures so you can set up a framework for how you communicate in a way that's going to create the maximum protection of your communications, your emails and texts and anything else that you write down. And by the way, stop writing bad emails. Think about, before you write an email, how that's going to look on a huge screen in a courtroom or perhaps a deposition room while you're under oath. Do you want to be questioned about that email? And if you're uncomfortable with that, either don't write it or write it in a way that your outside counsel has described and created for you so that that email is privileged and protected. And the privilege applies only if the email was created in order to help counsel provide legal advice. And that has to be the primary purpose of that email, text, or other type of electronic or hard copy communication. So when there's a breach, your outside counsel should be coordinating everything. A lot of people call outside counsel breach coaches. I think a more accurate term is breach quarterback, because they need to be on the field, not just sitting on the sidelines. They need to be handing the ball off, passing the ball, calling audibles at the line, and directing and guiding the team down the field. And that goes with internal folks as well as external, third parties, and there's all kinds of internal and external people that have to get involved as a team to address a data breach or incident. And a lot of this stuff is repetitive, but we only have a few minutes left, so I'll go through it again. Please take time to look closer at these slides, and feel free to take Alan up, please, on our offer to sit down and talk about how this really affects your company or organization. But things need to be done, communications need to be handled in a very careful way that is orchestrated by your outside counsel. And then this slide has to do with their work with third parties. These third parties need to be retained, and third parties need to be managed in terms of how they communicate so that your communications with them, whether it's a forensics team or an HR firm or a PR firm, those communications need to be kept and managed in a way that maximizes their protection so they don't become exhibits at a trial. The one thing I wanted to touch on very briefly here is the importance of not destroying documents. I think it's important for companies to stop keeping all their emails first. Stop keeping everything. It's expensive, but worst, it could get extremely problematic if you're sued, because then it gets really expensive and risky. You have to hire lawyers to go through all those emails. Then you have to send them over to the other side if they're responsive to a document request. And let me tell you, that's where the bodies are buried. That's where the hot evidence is for your opponent. It will be in emails. Every case now turns on a handful of emails. So stop writing them, or if you're going to write them, hand them over to your lawyer, put your lawyer involved in that so that they can be protected. But you can't be destroying emails either if they are responsive to a dispute. So there's a whole body of law dealing with retaining emails and the obligation to preserve them. It's called a litigation hold, and we can't get into it here. It's a little bit off topic, but it's very related because it has to do with your data. It'll tell you what you have to keep and what you don't have to keep, and I say in the second half of that, what you don't have to keep, get rid of it. It's just going to cause you headaches and problems down the line. So here's a summary of the 5 tips that we've all touched on here. And the one, again, that cannot be overemphasized enough is education. Communicating all of these issues with your employees, with the leadership at your company. Don't be a wallflower. Talk to your underlings, overlings, colleagues. Communicate these issues. Hand out these presentations. Alert them, because what they don't do can and will be used against them, your company, and perhaps even you in a court of law. So be careful out there.
You know, Hillard, I have to tell you, after listening to you, I'm not sure I want to stay CEO of a company.
It's a great job, but it's a risky one, and it's one that, you know, has the obligation squarely.
But having said that, I've had conversations with Dan in regards to these policies that when it goes out to the endpoint, and Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, that you can identify breaches of policies, breaches of company guidelines or procedures, and at least have a methodology for identifying them and then giving management a way to deal with them. How does that work?
Well, it encompasses all the things we were just discussing, right? It encompasses, you know, there's aspects of risk management, there's the legal aspects of you know, the compliance nature, and then, you know, technical staff interpreting with the guidance of Hillard, you know, interpreting those requirements into specific, discrete, endpoint kind of policies. You know, we've even done policies, for example, for just human performance factors. So let's say in keeping with your PCI compliance, you have an audit, some kind of an auditing solution around your privileged users. You may have a policy, a company policy that says the manager of such and such department will review, you know, the logs or the access rights of those privileged users and so on. And so the auditing could be against, you know, that manager's activities. Is that manager actually reviewing the logs once a week or twice a week or once a quarter, whatever the requirement is? So it's the intersection of the regulation as digested and understood as how it appropriately fits our organization with the technology that can go and count and measure these things.
Thank you. We're coming close to the end. I want to remind everybody that this presentation has been recorded and will be available to anybody who wants to see it again. And we still have that offer of a no-cost consultation service for everybody, so please take advantage of it. And people can reach me at aheyman, H-E-Y-M-A-N, at smlrgroup.com. And there it is up on the screen. I'd like to thank everybody for the panel and everybody else for participating. Goodbye and have a nice day.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.